They say truth is stranger than fiction, but sometimes it's also much scarier. Imagine walking home late at night, hearing twigs snapping behind you, only to turn around and find someone crouched in the shadows. Or hearing your mother's voice calling you from the basement, only to realize she's upstairs. These aren't urban legends or made-up horror stories. They're real experiences, lived by people just like you. In this video, we're sharing 10 terrifying true stories of survival, mystery, and fear. From chilling stalkers to horrifying supernatural encounters, these tales will make your skin crawl. What would you do if a stranger tried to lock you in their basement? Or if you stumbled across something gruesome in an abandoned house? What about being attacked on a trail in the middle of nowhere, or watching an imaginary friend come to life in the most unsettling way? Each of these stories reminds us that fear doesn't always stay in the realm of fiction. Sometimes, it steps into our reality. So sit back and get comfortable, but don't get too relaxed. After hearing these stories, you might find yourself double-checking your locks, or questioning the safety of even the most ordinary places. Stay tuned as we delve into these spine-chilling accounts of real-life horror. It was a chilly evening, and the teenager had taken this route many times before. The walk to his girlfriend's house was a familiar one, a quiet, suburban street lined with trees, with only the occasional car passing by. But tonight felt different. As he strolled, he noticed faint rustling in the bushes beside the sidewalk. He stopped and turned to look but saw nothing. Shrugging it off as a stray animal, he continued on his way. But the noises persisted. Twigs snapping, bushes shaking, and then the unmistakable sound of light footsteps. His pulse quickened. He quickened his pace, pulling his jacket tighter around him, and glanced over his shoulder, but the street behind him was empty. When he finally reached his girlfriend's house, he let out a breath of relief and knocked on the door. She opened it with a warm smile, but her expression quickly turned to one of horror. "Behind you!" she screamed. Before he could turn, a man lunged at him from the shadows. The attacker was crouched low, his face partially hidden by a hood. He tackled the teenager, sending them both sprawling onto the front yard. His girlfriend screamed, and her sudden panic seemed to startle the man. He muttered something incoherent and scrambled to his feet, darting back into the darkness from where he came. Shaken but unharmed, the teenager rushed inside with his girlfriend. They locked the doors and immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they scoured the area but found no sign of the attacker. The only evidence of his presence was a small patch of trampled grass near the bushes. 4 weeks after the incident, the teenager couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that he was still being watched. Every walk felt heavier, every shadow more menacing. He never took that route to his girlfriend's house again. The storm hit without warning, rattling the windows of the small family home. Rain poured down in sheets, and thunder roared like cannon fire. Inside, the family of 4 was gathered in the living room, enjoying the cozy shelter of their home as lightning lit up the sky outside. Then came the pounding on the door. At first, they thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch blown against the house. But the knocks grew louder, more deliberate, sending a chill through the room. The father stood, his face tense. "Stay here," he said, motioning for his wife and children to remain on the couch. As he approached the door, the knocking stopped. A brief silence followed, interrupted only by the sound of rain. Slowly, he peered through the peephole. What he saw made his blood run cold. A man stood on the porch, drenched from head to toe. He held a sharp tool, a screwdriver or knife, in his hand, which he raised toward the door as if preparing to force his way inside. The father's voice was firm as he called out, "Get off my property. I'm calling the police." The man didn't respond. Instead, he banged harder on the door, his face contorted with rage. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the intruder's wild eyes. The father didn't wait. He grabbed a baseball bat from the coat closet and opened the door just a crack, enough to shout through but not enough to let the man in. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." For a moment, the man hesitated, his expression flickering between anger and fear. Then he turned and stumbled off the porch, disappearing into the rain. The family immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes. Officers patrolled the neighborhood and eventually found the man wandering a few streets over, still clutching his weapon. He appeared disoriented and unstable, muttering to himself about things no one could understand. Later, the family learned that the man had a history of erratic behavior and had been reported by several neighbors earlier that evening. Although the intruder was apprehended, the family was left shaken. The storm no longer felt like a cozy backdrop but a reminder of how quickly safety could be shattered. For weeks, the children refused to sleep in their own beds, and the father began keeping the baseball bat within arm's reach at all times. The story became a local legend, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they were safe just because they were home. It started as a typical Saturday afternoon in the small suburban home. A young boy was playing with his toys in the living room while his mother busied herself upstairs. The house was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the washing machine in the basement. Then he heard it. "Come here, sweetie," his mother's voice called softly from below. He froze, his small hands gripping his toy. Something about the voice sounded off, not quite like his mother's usual tone. "Mom?" he called back hesitantly. "Yes, honey," the voice replied, beckoning him. "Come down here." The boy stood, his curiosity getting the better of him. He walked to the basement door, which was slightly ajar, and peered into the darkness. "Sweetheart, I need your help," the voice coaxed. But just as he reached for the door handle, he heard footsteps behind him. "Why are you standing there?" his mother asked, her voice full of concern. The boy whipped around and saw her standing at the top of the stairs, holding a basket of laundry. His face went pale. "But you were calling me from the basement." The mother's heart sank as she processed his words. She gently pulled him away from the door and peered into the basement herself. "Stay here," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. Switching on the light, she descended the creaking wooden stairs, her eyes scanning the room. It was empty. Just the washer, dryer, and a pile of old boxes. She checked every corner, even opening the storage closets, but there was nothing unusual. Still, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something had been there. When she returned upstairs, she found her son sitting on the couch, his face pale and tear-streaked. He told her everything, how the voice had called to him, how it sounded like hers but wasn't quite right. That night, she locked the basement door and left the hallway light on. Neither of them mentioned the incident again, but for weeks afterward, the boy refused to go near the basement. Even as an adult, he couldn't enter a basement without feeling a prickle of unease. Whether it was a trick of the mind or something more sinister, one thing was clear: the voice in the basement didn't belong to his mother. For the retired grandfather, walking his dog along the remote wooded trails behind his house was a cherished routine. The fresh air, the quiet rustle of leaves, and the companionship of his loyal retriever, Max, made it the highlight of his morning. But on this particular day, something felt off. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. As he rounded a bend, he noticed a figure up ahead, a man in a dark hoodie, standing motionless. "Good evening," the grandfather called out, trying to sound friendly. The man didn't respond, nor did he move. Max let out a low growl, his hackles rising. Uneasy, the grandfather decided to turn back. But as he retraced his steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every so often, he glanced over his shoulder, catching glimpses of the hooded figure trailing him at a distance. The attack came suddenly. As the grandfather approached a narrow section of the trail, the hooded man lunged from the bushes, knocking him to the ground. The attacker's face was obscured, but his movements were frenzied, his intent clear. Max sprang into action, barking furiously and biting at the man's arm. The distraction gave the grandfather just enough time to reach into his pocket and grab the small canister of pepper spray he always carried. A quick spray to the attacker's face sent him reeling, cursing as he stumbled back into the trees. The grandfather scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he held onto Max's leash and backed away. By the time he reached the safety of his home, the adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling fear. He called the police, who searched the area but found no trace of the hooded man. The grandfather couldn't help but wonder if the encounter was random, or if the man had been watching him for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. For weeks afterward, he avoided the trails, sticking to well-lit sidewalks and busier routes. Max, too, seemed on edge, barking at the slightest noise. Though life eventually returned to normal, the memory of that day remained vivid in his mind, a stark reminder that even in the quietest places, danger can lurk unseen. The abandoned house at the end of the street had always been a source of fascination for two neighborhood boys, Jake and Eric. With its boarded-up windows, sagging roof, and overgrown yard, it looked like something out of a horror movie. One summer afternoon, curiosity got the better of them. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they decided to sneak inside. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dusty, dimly lit hallway. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep within the house. "This is awesome," Eric whispered, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. Jake wasn't so sure. Something about the house felt wrong, but he didn't want to seem like a coward. As they explored the main floor, they stumbled upon a large, empty living room. In the center of the room, perched on a broken coffee table, was what appeared to be a Halloween prop, a severed human head. "Wow," Eric said, stepping closer. "This thing looks so real." Jake shone his flashlight on it, and his stomach churned. It wasn't a prop. Blood dripped from the neck, pooling onto the table. "Eric," Jake whispered, his voice trembling, "that's real." Before Eric could respond, a loud creak came from the ceiling above them, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. The boys froze, their eyes darting to the stairwell at the edge of the room. Whoever, or whatever, was upstairs was now moving. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing in the silence. "Let's go," Jake hissed, grabbing Eric's arm. They bolted out the door, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran down the street, not stopping until they reached Jake's house. Out of breath and pale with fear, they told Jake's parents what they'd seen. His father called the police, who cordoned off the house and conducted a thorough search. What the boys had stumbled upon wasn't just a gruesome sight, it was evidence of a crime. Investigators discovered that the head was linked to a gang-related killing, and the house had been used as a dumping ground. For Jake and Eric, the thrill of exploring the abandoned house turned into a nightmare they would never forget. Neither of them ever ventured into another haunted house again, and the memory of the severed head haunted their dreams for years. Sometimes, curiosity doesn't just kill the cat, it leaves scars that last a lifetime. It was a quiet evening in a rural town, the kind where unexpected visitors were rare. A mother was preparing dinner while her two children played in the living room. The sun had just set, and the golden hues of dusk were fading into the cool darkness of the night. The knock at the door startled her. Visitors rarely came this late. She peeked through the curtains and saw a man standing on the porch, holding a clipboard and wearing a cheap-looking suit. "Ma'am," he called out, "I'm a salesman from the city. I'm selling home security system. Can I take a few minutes of your time?" Something about him seemed off. His clothes didn't quite fit, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. The mother hesitated before opening the door slightly, keeping the chain lock in place. "I'm not interested, thank you," she said politely but firmly. As the man tried to convince her to let him in, she noticed something alarming. A van parked at the end of the driveway. The engine was still running, and through the windshield, she could make out the shapes of several men sitting inside. Her instincts kicked in. "Look," she interrupted, her tone sharp, "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave right now." The man's smile faltered. He stammered something about just doing his job, but when she held up her phone, he backed away. "Have a good night, ma'am," he muttered before hurrying to the van. The vehicle sped off, tires screeching on the gravel road. Shaken, The mother reported the incident to the local sheriff. The following day, she learned that similar vans had been spotted in nearby towns, with reports of suspicious men casing homes under the guise of selling product. Though they hadn't broken in or harmed anyone yet, the sheriff suspected the group was scouting for easy target. The mother was grateful she had trusted her instincts. From that night on, she kept the porch light on, reinforced the locks on the doors, and always made sure her phone was within reach. The incident became a chilling reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself with a bang. It can come disguised with a clipboard and a fake smile. Were close friends, Matt and Ryan, were seasoned backcountry skiers who thrived on the thrill of exploring remote trails and camping in the wild. One winter, they decided to embark on a multi-day skiing trip deep in the backcountry. It was meant to be an escape from the bustle of city life, a chance to reconnect with nature. Their second evening was uneventful, calm, serene, with only the sounds of the crackling campfire and the wind brushing through the trees. But as night fell, the isolation became more pronounced, and an uneasy quiet settled over their campsite. It was around midnight when they heard the crunch of snow underfoot. "Did you hear that?" Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Matt nodded, gripping his flashlight. A shadowy figure appeared just beyond the glow of their fire, a man dressed in mismatched winter gear, holding what looked like a walking stick. "Evening," the man called out, his tone overly casual. "Mind if I join you? I'm looking for a campsite." The man didn't wait for a response. He walked closer, the firelight revealing his face, weathered, gaunt, with eyes that darted nervously. Something about him felt off, but Matt and Ryan didn't want to provoke him. "Sure, you can sit for a bit," Matt said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man crouched by the fire, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He didn't talk much, but the way he kept glancing at their gear made the friends uneasy. After what felt like an eternity, the man stood abruptly. "Well, I'll be on my way," he said, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he'd arrived. The friends didn't sleep much that night, keeping their flashlights and tools within reach. Just before dawn, they heard rustling outside the tent. "Probably an animal," Ryan muttered, but Matt wasn't so sure. He unzipped the tent slightly and shone his flashlight toward the noise. The stranger from the night before lunged at the tent, wielding a hatchet. Matt yelled, scrambling to grab his flare gun. Ryan kicked at the intruder through the fabric of the tent, buying Matt enough time to fire the flare. The bright light and sharp hiss startled the man, who stumbled back, cursing. He fled into the woods, leaving his tracks in the snow. After packing up their gear in a hurry, Matt and Ryan skied back toward the trailhead, desperate to put distance between them and the attacker. Hours later, they stumbled upon a campsite, one that didn't belong to them. Among the scattered gear, Matt recognized something horrifying, a jacket and backpack belonging to a skier who had gone missing earlier that month. The friends reported the incident to local authorities, who eventually located the missing skier alive but severely injured a few miles away. As for the stranger, he was never found. The trip left Matt and Ryan shaken, their love for backcountry adventures forever tainted by the memory of that harrowing night. They still wonder what might have happened if they hadn't been prepared to fight back. The wilderness can be beautiful, but as they learned, it can also hide dangers far more terrifying than the elements. It was late at night, and a college student was finishing up an essay in his small apartment. The hum of his laptop and the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallway were the only sounds breaking the silence. Then, something caught his eye. Through the gap in his curtains, he noticed a man lingering outside his building, standing too close to one of the windows. He squinted, focusing on the scene below. The man wasn't alone. He was leaning unnervingly close to a female neighbor, who stood with her arms crossed, her body language screaming discomfort. The student turned off his lamp to avoid drawing attention and kept watching. The man was tall, wearing a worn leather jacket, and his gestures were exaggerated, too casual, too familiar. What made the scene more unsettling was how he reached out to stroke her hair. She flinched but didn't step back, her eyes darting toward her door as if calculating her chances of escape. The student grabbed his phone, ready to call for help if the situation escalated. As the man inched closer, the student acted. He pushed open his window and called out loudly, "Hey, everything okay down there?" The man froze, his head snapping toward the voice. The neighbor took the opportunity to dart inside her apartment, slamming the door behind her. The man lingered for a moment, glaring up at the student, before disappearing into the night. The next day, the student spoke with his neighbor, who thanked him profusely. She admitted she hadn't known how to handle the situation and was terrified he might try to force his way inside. The man didn't return, but the experience left them both shaken. It was a grim reminder that even in a crowded apartment complex, danger can find its way to your doorstep. And sometimes, all it takes is a watchful eye and a willingness to act to prevent a potentially horrific outcome. It seemed like a simple errand. A man had found a listing online for a ping-pong table being sold by a homeowner nearby. The price was fair, and the seller seemed polite enough over the phone. After setting up a time to meet, the buyer arrived at the man's house on a quiet street. The seller greeted him at the door, a wide smile plastered on his face. Something about his demeanor felt forced, but the buyer brushed it off as social awkwardness. "The table's in the basement," the man said, motioning for him to follow. The basement was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. The ping-pong table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by boxes and old furniture. "Go ahead, take a look," the seller said, lingering by the stairs. The buyer walked over, inspecting the table. It was in decent condition, though a bit dusty. He turned to ask a question but froze when he heard the door at the top of the stairs slam shut. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tense. The seller didn't answer. Instead, he locked the door with an audible click, his footsteps retreating as the buyer realized he was trapped. Panic set in as the buyer searched for a way out. He banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. Then he noticed a small basement window near the ceiling, partially obscured by a stack of boxes. With adrenaline surging, he dragged the boxes aside and hoisted himself up. The window was barely large enough to squeeze through, but he managed to wriggle out and drop into the backyard. Once free, he sprinted to a neighbor's house and called the police. When officers arrived, they found the homeowner still inside, but the situation took an even darker turn during their investigation. The seller was linked to a series of illegal activities, including theft and fraud. There were even rumors of prior incidents involving other unsuspecting buyers. The man who had escaped was shaken but relieved to have trusted his instincts and acted quickly. The incident became a cautionary tale for the local community, a reminder that even something as simple as buying an item online could take a sinister turn. The buyer no longer meets strangers alone and always ensures transactions happen in public places. He knows how close he came to becoming part of a story with a much darker ending. It started innocently enough. A young child in the care of their babysitter began mentioning an imaginary friend named Agnes. At first, the babysitter thought nothing of it. Children often create imaginary friends as part of their playful imagination. "She's nice," the child would say, giggling as they played with their toys. "She likes to play with me when you're not looking." The babysitter smiled, chalking it up to harmless fun. But as the days passed, things began to feel off. One evening, while tidying up the playroom, the babysitter heard a faint creak behind her. Turning around, she noticed the door, which had been closed just moments before, slowly swinging open. She froze, her heart racing. The child peeked up from their spot on the carpet and smiled. "Agnes likes to watch you," they said casually before returning to their toys. The sitter laughed nervously, brushing off the moment as a coincidence. But the unease lingered. Later that night, as she settled onto the couch, the sound of toys activating broke the silence. The battery-operated ones buzzed and whirred, their lights flashing. She walked into the playroom and found the child sitting cross-legged, staring at the toys. "Agnes wants to play," the child said without turning around. The babysitter decided to put the child to bed early, hoping the eerie events would end with the night. After tucking them in, she went to the kitchen to clean up. That's when she heard it, a soft giggle echoing from the hallway. She called out to the child, assuming they had gotten out of bed, but there was no response. Grabbing her phone, she walked toward the hallway. The giggling stopped, replaced by a faint creaking sound. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, the child looked up from their bed. "Agnes says good night," they whispered before rolling over and falling asleep. When the parents returned home later that evening, the babysitter told them everything. They laughed it off, saying their child had always been imaginative. But the babysitter refused to return after that night. The experience left her shaken, and even years later, the thought of Agnes still sends chills down her spine. Some imaginary friends, it seems, are anything but imaginary.